Welcome, class. So we are at the end of the end of the semester, our last class here, and what we're going to focus on is the rise of National Socialism, the Third Reich, Nazism in Germany, and the coming to power in Hitler in 1933, which will lead to all sorts of horrible and tragic things, including the Holocaust and World War II. So it's a very dark history we're ending on. So we're going to account for the ways in which the Nazis and National Socialism used art as propaganda, as a weapon. And then we're going to end with some of these wonderful examples of artists on the other side who pushed back and tried to resist the Nazi juggernaut in Europe. So let's start with a good definition, which comes from your book. I think we can apply this to the Soviet Union, the Stalinist Soviet Union, once it becomes a totalitarian, authoritarian communist state. So that's an example of a left-wing political ideology becoming totalitarian. But of course, right-wing ideologies have an equal, if not more inherent tendency to become totalitarian. And you don't get much more to the right than fascism, this militarized police state where everyone comes under the control of a dictator or of a Führer, in the case of Hitler in Germany. And so this is a very large history that we're opening up here from the latter part of the early 20th century. What we're going to focus on, of course, in this class, though, is art and aesthetics, right? So in totalitarian regimes, art was treated as a weapon, as an ideological weapon. And we saw this a little bit, at least quite a bit, actually, with the Soviet Union and socialist realism. The state will also then assume monopoly over all cultural institutions. And then the most conservative art movements in totalitarian regimes, and this is true of both the left and the right, it would seem, are made official. They're made the official cultural forms. And then, of course, all other styles are condemned, right? So we saw this in the Soviet Union, and we saw this, and we're going to see this for sure in Germany, and with the National Socialist movement and the rise of Hitler, where anything other than very, very traditional, very conservative, and very ideologically convenient forms of art are going to be championed, and all others are going to be deemed to be quite literally, quote unquote, degenerate, as you're going to see. And so one of the great thinkers of the early 20th century is Walter Benjamin, and maybe one of the most important essays is Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction from 1935. And he has a quote in here that tells us a lot. He could tell. He's writing in the mid-30s here, so already Hitler is in power here, and Benjamin has to escape because he's a German Jew. And he actually doesn't end up getting out of Europe. He ends up being killed somewhere in Spain. So he could feel what was going on, and he's a wonderful diagnostician of the time. So there's this really well-known line from the end of this essay where he talks about the aestheticization of politics and the politics of aesthetics. This has had a lot of legs in art theory and in art history. And so let's not, for time, let's focus simply on the last two lines here, where he's talking about the rise of fascism. And he says this is a situation of politics which fascism renders aesthetic. So his point there is that fascism, like the Nazis, like National Socialism, they treat politics, social organization, the political realm of life as a surface level aesthetic, that it's simply a visual covering, basically, that's a form of mystification, that's a form of propaganda, that's a form of rendering the people more or less subsumed and numb. anesthetized and aesthetics sort of work together in this reading. Whereas for Benjamin, who's definitely on the left, and he would be a champion of communism and of the Russian Revolution, he says instead communism responds by politicizing art. So art itself becomes political, it becomes engaged, which is the opposite of politics becoming art, right? So if politics becomes art, you basically have politicians who are all surface level. They say things that are spectacular. They almost put on a show. It's a type of entertainment. I think you're seeing how this quote is resonating with our own time, where more and more politicians, even the president himself, the political landscape feels more like a reality show or a soap opera gone very wrong, at least for some of us. It's a complete aestheticization of the political domain that's used to keep control, right? For Benjamin, politics has lost his way when this happens. So for him, artists push back, and art itself then will be political. Right? So politics becoming art, or art becoming politics. That's the choice that Benjamin is giving us here. And the artists that we champion, usually in art history of the early 20th century, are those artists that politicized art rather than agreeing with the aestheticization of politics. So some examples will be helpful. How did the Nazis aestheticize politics? How did they treat it as just like almost like an art spectacle? One way is through film. Unfortunately, in film history, Leni Riefenstahl, who was a filmmaker who was directly involved with the Nazis, she made a lot of breakthroughs at the level of form, at the level of technique in cinema history. The reason it's unfortunate is that she did it all for the service of the totalitarian state. And so film is one of those things that can really work on the spectator, that can really work on its audience. I don't know about you, but when I watched films, it's one of those things like music, even more so than static visual arts, can really pull on my heartstrings, right? It can really elicit powerful emotions. And so think of cinema doing this in the case of Riefenstahl and in the case of National Socialism as a way not simply to create, wonderful emotions in the viewer, but also to keep them faithful to the Führer and to the Third Reich. Which then it amounts to cinema as a form of propaganda. So I won't show you the whole clip, but this is the beginning of Triumph of the Will, which is a film that documents a very well-known rally in Nuremberg. And so it starts off with this incredible, this is 1935, this incredible shot in the clouds over a plain. And then you're seeing overhead views of Germany. Everyone organizing, everyone coming to the march. The arrival of Hitler himself. And it's a form of film that's supposed to elicit a nationalistic type of patriotic feeling, and to show the state all lionizing and idolizing the Führer, and everyone seemingly happy and everything going well, right? And so for Benjamin, this would be a clear example of politics becoming an aesthetic, the aestheticization of politics, of politics becoming like an art spectacle. It's very, very clear here. So I'll stop there. I think you understand the message. So Triumph of the Will. So cinema was used as a weapon in the Third Reich, but art itself was also a part of this ideological struggle at the time. So in 1937, the Nazi Party put up an exhibition called the Degenerate Art Exhibition. This is the cover of the catalog. This is outside of it with people lining up. And it was a major exhibition. It was very, very large. And it's interesting. What they did is they showed all the works of the historical avant-gardes that we've been talking about this semester. Cubism, German Expressionism. Some of these German Expressionists actually were part of the Nazi Party, so they weren't happy that they got lumped into the quote-unquote degenerate art. But Der Blaue Reiter, Die Brücke, Fauvism, Dada, all these things were all thrown together. And the thing to realize about this is that the exhibition was trying to mock this work. The very term degenerate means that it's bad art, it's deviant art, and degenerate has other really sort of nefarious connotations, which we'll talk about in a second. But the thing to realize is that it's showing works of art that are corrupted, and they're trying to ridicule it. So like you see all the drawing and this kind of faux Kandinsky kind of stuff, and then writings about Dada that are interspersed within the work itself. This was a show that was trying to mock the historical avant-gardes. Here's a picture of the highest of the Nazi Party coming to actually even visit the show. So Goebbels is here, the Minister of Culture, and who was a big fan of film, by the way. So if anybody's ever seen Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, all this stuff with film within that history, and the fact that the Nazis, especially Goebbels, really appreciated film, that's all true. That's all a real part of the history. And then Hitler himself came to the show. So it was a way to try to ridicule avant-garde forms of art of the early 20th century. And this is maybe the most important takeaway of this show. And this is really sad and nefarious and rather sick. The exhibition, the way it tried to ridicule avant-garde art from the early 20th century was to make an analogy between the way in which abstraction, formal experimentation that you're seeing here on the left, they thought and they deemed that to be degenerate in the same way that other races or people who are differently abled are degenerate at the level of the human race, right? So the central thrust of this show was to say that avant-garde art is degenerate. It's a gross deviation of what art should be, in the same way that some human beings are degenerate and gross deviations of how human beings should be, right? So here is where we get this horrible and sad history of anti-Semitism. So a lot of this degenerate art was deemed to be Jewish. Also red baiting, the idea that a lot of this art would be communist. But then also the idea that this art is in some ways mentally degenerate or physically warped, which is how they deemed human beings who were born or had some kind of infirmity or a condition that made them disabled, more differently abled, right? So it's a really gross analogy, right? And it's not only at the level of art here, and you can see how art is being used as a weapon here. Art is being used as a weapon to not only attack artists and experimental forms of art, but also it's being used in the surface of attacking certain types of people. And know that this leads very directly to the Holocaust itself, because who gets killed? What's the mass genocide of the Holocaust? Well, it's Jews, but it's also people who are not normative at the level of heterosexuality, within the eyes of the Nazis, and then people who are born differently, right? So it's a really sad and difficult history, and art plays a central role here for the Nazis. So they not only used art as a propaganda to lionize themselves, but they also used what they deemed to be the other side, the degenerate side of art, and used that as a weapon as well in this very famous show. And so what they did on the other side of the street here, of the Degenerate Art exhibition, they had the Great German Art exhibition. And here you had something completely different. You had art that went back. Remember, art of totalitarian regimes, they're always very rearguard. It's always the most conservative forms of art. And so here you have art that was basically neoclassical. Art that looks like Greco-Roman statue, or art that looks like it would be painted in the Renaissance or during the neoclassical period. Like here's a portrait of Hitler as if it's Napoleon painted by David, right? So this does not get any more old and conservative. And here was Hitler's favorite sculptor, Arno Breker, and this is called Readiness. And so here you have like a Greco-Roman statue, but on steroids, like really amped up, really macho, toxically macho, with a sword. It's this very strange amalgamation of like contemporary forms of like a body cult. The Germans definitely were. The Nazi Party was definitely there was a youthful cult to it, but also this obsession with the haleness and the health of the human body. So you have a mix of that with Greco-Roman statue. But then the other thing that this exhibition was trying to do was to show, whereas we have sick bodies in the Degenerate show, here you have healthy, hygienic bodies. So the term hygiene is really important here, because Nazi ideology was all about trying to make the world more hygienic, to get all the corrupt, degenerate things out of society, which included art and people and other things, right? So this betrayed this kind of impulse to create beautiful, hygienic human beings, right? According to this sort of Aryan race theory of the Nazis. So it's pretty nefarious in the way art was used here. There are a couple things that are funny here, though. One, you definitely get the sense that this statue is overcompensating. Like someone like Michelangelo would laugh at this, because he would say, like, well, what are you overcompensating for here with all these muscles and all this tough posturing, right? So maybe the underside of this is a lurking vulnerability and ambivalence, which we've talked about before in this class. The other thing that's funny is that this show was far less popular than this show. This is still the most visited show in museum history. So it attracted a huge attention. Now, we should be careful here, because this is an important sociological question. Were people coming there simply to like laugh and agree with the party line of the Nazis, or were there a lot of people there that were stimulated by the work and secretly enjoyed it and thought, oh wow, I'm getting to see like advanced art, whereas I live in a culture now that's repressive, and all they allow is very old, uninteresting art, right? It's possible. So it's an interesting question. So another way in which art was used within this history of the totalitarian regimes, we actually now see both head off against each other. Totalitarian communism of the Stalinist Soviet Union, once this sort of utopian dream of the October Revolution turned into a totalitarian Stalinist nightmare. They had a pavilion here on the right. This is, of course, I think you know where this is. This is in Paris. This is in the same year, 1937. There was this very large international exposition where all these different countries came to show their best architecture, their best art, their best product, so on and so forth. These usually happened every few years. So this year it was in Paris. You have the Tour Eiffel in the center. This is the Trocadero. It's still there today when you visit Paris, along with the Tour Eiffel, obviously. But you also had pavilions that certain countries built. So here is the Soviet Union one, which in 1937 represents Stalin's communist state. And then you had the German pavilion, which represented the Nazi Party. And there's been a lot of ink spilled on this exhibition and the standoff between these two pavilions. You have this large monolithic neoclassical, again, very old style of the German pavilion, and then the more dynamic slightly constructivist, but also socially much more socialist realist of the worker, the peasant, and the worker standing off and moving left to right, up, like into the future, right? So notice there's the hammer and sickle. The sickle represents farming, agrarian knowledge, and then the hammer represents industry, right, and factories and that sort of thing. So that's where the hammer and sickle comes from for the emblem of the flag of the Soviet Union. So you had this standoff between the Nazis and the Stalinists and the communists from the Soviet Union. And in the middle, of course, was Europe and France. And so this is a literalization of the powers that are about to go to war in World War II. Three major powers until the U.S. comes in many ways to save us from the Nazi regime, though the Soviet did a lot too to defeat the Nazis. These are the three superpowers in Europe that are about to go to war. So what an intense exhibition! What an intense standoff at Pavilions. So this was the German one was built by Albert Speer, who was the favorite architect for Hitler. And here's a model of it, so you can tell there's the eagle that's on top. That's an emblem of the Third Reich with the swastika, and then these large engaged columns. This kind of neoclassical building, and there's been a lot written about this structure. And one of the things to note is that it's very mausoleum-like. It's almost like a pavilion or a monument to death. And certainly, if there was ever a regime that was kind of a death cult, it would have been the Nazis. And then on the other side, you can see more clearly this more dynamic composition of the Soviet pavilion with the worker and the peasant striving together for the Soviet state. So we have a standoff between neoclassical Nazi totalitarian art and socialist realist totalitarian art, and there's even video. It's quite fantastic, in color no less, of this very famous pavilion. I always love seeing old footage. I mean, I know Paris pretty well. I've been there a lot, and my family's originally from France, so it's so interesting to see a city you know well, with people walking around from close to a century ago. And of course these things would be very popular, and I'm assuming everybody would be well aware of this kind of standoff. It's almost as if the upright posture of this German pavilion is kind of deflecting the energy of the Soviet pavilion. So a very famous standoff. And so now enough of the totalitarian art. Let's talk a bit about some of the artists who pushed back at these historical events and the rise of fascism. So one of the ways in which there was one of the terrains in which you had a struggle against Nazism would be through the media, and would be through montage, and especially photo montage. So this is the front page of a journal, of a magazine in 1932. That's basically propaganda for the state, right? So you have Hitler in the center. You have the rest of Germany like beneath him, the masses of people here, and then these the Gestapo or this fascist police that are saluting to him, right? Then you're seeing like the very healthy German family, and then in this one you're seeing a very unfortunate anti-Semitic visual culture, a very anti-Semitic trope, especially of this figure in the back. So if there was ever a moment where you had a leader who preyed on the fear of his people by basically redirecting that fear onto another ethnicity, in this case the Jewish people, that's what you had in Germany. So you're seeing it playing out in the press, in the visual culture here. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Tit for tat, you had artists that come along and start using photomontage as we've studied it in Dada, but to do it much more directly. Dada was a little more freewheeling and chaotic. You remember Hannah Hawke's photomontage. In the instance of a photomontage in the service from the left pushing back against the Nazis, you're going to have a much more direct form of politicized photomontage. So now we're moving from the aestheticization of politics. This is the aestheticization of politics, as is all this, like art being used as subsumed within an ideology. Now, within a state ideology, now you have art that gets politicized to push back, right? And it's going to try, this is important, if the aestheticization of politics is kind of surface level, masking reality kind of thing, then politicized art is going to do the opposite. It's going to try to reveal the horror and reveal the truth of the political landscape and the events that are surrounding this moment in history, right? So the really great artist of this kind of very direct political photomontage is John Hartfield, who we could have talked about with Dada, because he begins in Dada. But then with the rise of fascism in Germany, with the rise of the Nazis, he starts to move away from Dada to go from much more direct forms of photomontage. And he works with the Communist Party in order to try to fight the rise of fascism in his country. So this is a very early one that he did, which is right before 1933, right before Hitler gets elected. And this is a poster to try to help the Communist Party in Germany, which would also have been up for election. And so it's this photomontage that says, capitalism robs you of your last piece of bread, fight for yourself and your children, vote communist. And you're getting this really amazing image of this young boy who has this little piece of bread, and you get the sense like he's about to he's already in a state of famine, or he's about to his bread is about to be taken away from him, right? So it's a form of a photomontage and form of political visual culture that's really tugging at your heartstrings, but not in the service of fascism. Or liberal capitalism, but in the service of communism, right? So even if this is a more politicized image, like a more politicized form of art, it's still coming from a certain ideological point, just the opposite one from fascism, which would be communism. And this is confusing for a lot of people sometimes. So just always know that fascist ideology, fascist political parties and formations are very right-wing. Communism is very, very left-wing. It's very much on the left. They're in almost every way diametrically opposed until communism becomes authoritarian, and then they start to have some troubling similarities. And so what John Hartfield did, he started a magazine called AIZ, and he did all these incredible photomontages that were so clearly, wonderfully critical of Hitler and of the Nazis. And so I'll just show you a few. This worked from 1930 to 1938. At some point he has to leave Germany because he's risking his life, and he ends up in Prague and continues his work. So there's some really wonderful classic examples of his photomontage where he's ridiculing the rise of the Nazi Party. So here's one. This is Hitler, Adolf Hitler, the Superman swallows gold and spouts junk. So it's almost like this X-rayed image of his body. And if there was, Hitler was deemed to be this really wonderful orator, like he was a great speaker, according to a lot of people. And so what Hartfield is showing you is that, well, maybe he's a great speaker, but the stuff he's saying is junk. And it's really only in the service of money. Like he's a spineless human being that's basically just propped up by coins and money. So we're driving home the point that fascism talked a good talk to its people that everybody would be together, but in fact the Nazis, among many other things that they did, they continued to work with the capitalist class in Germany. Here's another one. The meaning of the Hitler salute: little man asks for big gifts. So it's the same message. Here you have Hitler doing the Hitler salute, but of course now it's been decontextualized and montaged in another sense. He changes the meaning of it. Now it looks like he's just grabbing money from this big capitalist that's behind him, like this titan of industry, right? So the big man is actually a little man who's beholden to the economic powers of his country. And so you can see how subversive these are. They also get very very violent, very difficult to look at. This one always makes me cringe. It hurts to look at it. This one's called your meals are lacking lard and butter. You can always eat your Jews. And so this is scathingly against anti-Semitism. I hope you understand the tone here. John Heartfield is being very darkly sarcastic here. Very, very darkly sarcastic here. He's not advocating anti-Semitism. He's showing you how disgusting anti-Semitism is, right? So he's conflating two things. People who might be impoverished, who might be hungry. This is Weimar Germany, after all. This is just after Weimar Germany. Things are still difficult when Nazi is in power. And so he says, well, just take it out on the Jews. And here you have a picture of a Jewish man who's being crushed on a piece of toast as if he's butter, right? And so this is really difficult stuff to look at. And it's also sadly prophetic, because quite literally in the Holocaust, Jews will be, of course, 6 million of them will be murdered in gas chambers. But what you may not know, and this is very dark, but their bodies, their fat, their hair, they would actually be used to make things like not butter, but soap or lampshades, felt. So the human remains would be used in industry, would be used for things in Germany. So this is incredibly dark. And you can see why Heartfield he's risking his life by presenting such a scathingly critical view of anti-Semitism in 1935 while he's living in Germany. Here's another one. I'm going to go more quickly now. Hooray, the butter is finished. Same thing. Like the people are starving. People don't have what they need. But don't revolt against the state. Just start eating weapons. Just start eating they're all basically holding up like ammunition, parts of a bike. The little baby has an axe with a swastika on it. The dog has bolts. And then, of course, in their home, it's wallpaper made of the Nazi swastika and Hitler presiding over the whole thing, right? So it's showing a family that's so beholden to their Fuhrer that they won't complain that they don't have food. They'll just start eating military stuff. And so this is a critique of budgets. Honestly, this is a critique of a state that prioritizes war over other things in their form of governance. And then here's Hitler as guerrilla. And this is just speaks for itself, right? This madman, brute that's standing over the world with a sword dripping in blood. So this is from 1943. Now the war is definitely is well underway in 1943. World War II goes from 1939 to 1945. So this resonates really well with a very classic film, and I've showed you Charlie Chaplin before in this class, so I want to show you one last time a clip from Chaplin. This is The Great Dictator from 1940, and this is a way of using film not as propaganda, not as an aestheticization of politics, as Benjamin says in the beginning, but film as a political act, as political art. Of course, I think you're seeing that those two terms are a little bit porous. Like sometimes they do meet, but this is a wonderful instance of film as satire and a thinly veiled critique and ridiculing of Hitler himself by Charlie Chaplin. And in this scene, which is a beautifully choreographed scene, you're going to hear the music of Wagner, who himself, he's one of the great composers in the Western tradition, but unfortunately he was also anti-Semitic, and his anti-Semitic views even had an influence on Nazism and on Hitler himself. And Wagner's music then almost became the official music of the Third Reich. So it's certainly tainted in that sense. So you're going to hear a little Wagner in this scene, and I will show it to you.
I want to be alone. Out Caesar, out Nolus, Emperor of the world.
It's a wonderful scene, and a wonderful film. So if you ever get to see any Chaplin films, The Great Dictator is definitely one of them. And so let's end now with just one work and one historical event that encapsulates all of what we've been talking about, the history of fascism and trying to fight fascism with art. You had in 1937, April 26, 1937, you had a terrible bombing that was part of the Spanish Civil War, which was going on around the same time going on right at the same time at the beginnings of World War II. And so in Spain you had another fascist, which is Franco, and you had a civil war between the fascists in Spain and the Republicans, those that wanted to have a republic in Spain. So by Republican, I don't mean the GOP, our party in this country. I mean Republican in the old sense, where you have a democratic republic, which they're trying to go back to after having fallen into fascist politics. And so part of this, this civil war is this horrible event where Franco elicits the help of Hitler and his well-known brigade of Condor pilots, the Condor Legion, these really well-known elite bombers. They come and they help Franco by bombing this small town in the Basque region called Guernica. And this is one of the first major bombings that was directed at civilians. These were all civilians in a marketplace that died. Men, women, and children. So it was horrible. And it became an international controversy of Hitler, Franco, and Mussolini, all the fascists that are sort of coming together at this moment, which is going to lead to World War II. It became this international outcry, as you can imagine, right? So here you have a picture of the aftermath of the bombing. Here you have a picture of the Condor Legion of the Nazi Air Force, and then just an example in French of the outrage of this moment of Guernica. And so we finish with our old friend Picasso, who was himself incensed by this, and there are debates as to how politically committed he was, but he was a fellow traveler and part of the Communist Party for a little while. And he made a work that was a direct response to this terrible bombing of Guernica, which he called Guernica, right? So this is a very large mural he did. And you're seeing an installation view of Guernica at the Spanish Republican Pavilion of 1937. So once again, you see how important this exhibition of 1937 was in Paris. You had the standoff between Germany and the Soviet Union, and then somewhere else there, you had the Spanish Republican Pavilion, which was advocating for an anti-fascist state. So Picasso gave a work, painted this work, Guernica, for this pavilion. And now it's gone down as Picasso's, almost certainly his most famous work, and one of these central pacifist anti-war works in the history of art. So here it is. It's syncretic. It's a use of different styles that Picasso was working with. So of course you have a mix of synthetic cubism in some ways. He's not actually using newspaper, but you do get a sense he's using this grisaille. He's using this kind of stippled effect to create newspaper. You do have this sense of collage, montage. It's all paint, but you do get the sense of this, and a type of cubist abstraction, right? But there's also certain surrealist elements. Picasso would have been a fellow traveler with the surrealists in the late 20s and 30s in some of the shapes and in some of the symbols. So he's depicting this bombing of Guernica, and we can go in and look at a few different things. So we have the bull here, which represents Franco, represents fascism, and then a mother with her dead child screaming underneath this very imposing bull with almost a head sprouting out of its own head. So the really frightening moment. Then you have a Republican Spanish soldier. He represents Spain, but the Republican side, not the fascist Franco side. He's down and likely dead. And his horse is also being attacked. So there's a nice animals play a big role in this, where you have the bull that signifies fascism and the horse that signifies Republican freedom and struggle. You have a woman who's being burned alive because of the bombing. You then have two light sources that are often read symbolically. So you have this very harsh light bulb, this artificial light that represents modernity, but also likely fascism. And then you have this woman with a candle, with a quote-unquote natural light source that represents a counterbalance, a counteracting light of truth, because there is a way in which she's lighting up the scene and showing us the whole scene. So it's a really rich work and highly allegorical, right? This is not a literal rendering of the scene. This is a rendering of this scene through Picasso's style. And then the question becomes: is this more effective as, let's say, a photograph of the after of the bombing, or is it less effective? Does it become subsumed either under Picasso or under art, and does it blunt the edge? these are fascinating conversations that I always, when we have class, when we're together, this is one of the things we talk a lot about, like whether or not painting and art can do something different for the visibility of a tragic event, as opposed to simply, a photograph, which is actually showing you the event itself. And he was influenced by the photographs of the bombing of Guernica. So you notice, there's a famous shot of Guernica burning, and then these buildings were bombed out, and it created this relief between the bombed out windows and the fire itself. So he tried to mimic these in the painting itself with these holes and with the stippling effect. And then, of course, the fact that Picasso, the palette he used was totally whites, grays, and blacks, right? No color here whatsoever. So that certainly resonates with photography, and also resonates with the mood of the event. He was also looking back to his own work. This is his Minotauromachy, which is a scene of the Minotaur attacking this young child with a candle, and then the horse in the middle. I think you can see a direct influence and a direct correspondence with the elements in this etching that he did and Guernica itself. So the influences are a mix of photography and a mix of Picasso's own use of symbolism and his own preoccupations that he had in the mid-30s. And then there's also a reference to art history itself. So Goya has a very famous painting called The 3rd of May from 1814, which is also about a real historical event of 1808, which is a different moment in Spanish political history, where Napoleon took over Spain and assassinated these insurgent rebels of again, Spanish Republicans who wanted their own state, wanted to govern their own Spain rather than be governed by an outside Napoleonic power. And so Goya painted this scene of these rebels, these political insurgents who are massacred, who are basically executed. And so you have the dark Napoleonic troops shooting these rebels, and then this light source that's dramatically lighting up the scene. So the source of light here, and the way in which he's lit up Guernica is often said to recall Goya's well-known painting here. And then just the last thing, one of the most consequential things in our lifetime was the decision in 2003, 2004 to go to war in Iraq after 9/11 and after Afghanistan. And there was a very famous briefing and meeting at the UN about, this is in New York now, there's a famous briefing at the UN about whether or not the Security Council would advocate for going to war. And the United States is basically making its case, right? Bush will end up going unilaterally anyways. But so you have this meeting in UN. And at the UN, it's well known, there's a tapestry that reproduces Picasso's Guernica. And for these meetings about going to war, it was covered up, which is a very interesting detail, because maybe there is something about this painting that even in our century, and the very beginnings of the War on Terror, maybe there was something about it that was threatening, because it's such a anti-war work that it was threatening to those there, and they needed to sort of cover it up. But again, how much art can do in the face of war, how much a painting or a tapestry can really do in the face of war, is a question that we need to mull over, and it's something we would talk about at length, whether or not this is just a futile thing that's on the wall, or maybe it could actually get into someone's mind, someone who's in a position of power, to then de-escalate rather than escalate warfare. So just an interesting final note on Guernica. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this last class, and everyone take care.